So after the huge success of the Avengers and what would become known as Phase 1, it was time for Marvel and fans alike to look forward to Phase 2, and the film that would be kicking off this initiative would be Iron Man 3. But the story of Iron Man 3 starts mere days after the release of Iron Man 2, where Paramount Pictures, who was of course having distributing rights for these Marvel properties, came into conflict with the Walt Disney Company and Marvel Entertainment. And due to ongoing negotiations, the movies had to be slightly delayed. So, in October of 2010, Walt Disney agreed to pay Paramount $115 million for the worldwide distribution rights to Iron Man 3. After this was done, the announcement was made that May 3rd, 2013 would see the release date of the third film. And just a couple of months after that agreement was made, in December of 2010, the director of the first and second Iron Man, Jon Favreau, decided not to return for the third movie, having cited the interference of Disney as one of his main problems. He would of course go on to direct the film Magic Kingdom instead, but he did remain executive producer on The Avengers and also served as the executive producer on the third Iron Man movie. A few months went by with nothing to hear about the movie up until February of 2011, where the internet found out that final negotiations started between Disney, Marvel, and Shane Black, who is of course now a famous director himself, but was once an actor as well. And just a month later, in March of 2011, Shane Black would announce that him and co-writer David Pence, who Marvel had worked on previously on the Runaway script, were hired to write the movie. And after it was announced that Shane Black would in fact be directing the movie, Robert Downey Jr. said that this was the best possible choice he could have hoped for and would be the only way he would sign off on a third movie, as the two had previously worked together on Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. And the first indicator that this movie might be different than what we've previously seen was when Shane Black was being interviewed and described this film more so than two men in iron suits fighting each other, and decided to compare it to something more along the lines of a Tom Clancy thriller, which would see Iron Man facing real-world type villains. And Drew Pearce would later come on and say that he did not want to do magic and space, and that Iron Man 3 would be more of a technological thriller set in a more realistic world than what fans were expecting after the huge success and the Battle of New York that we saw in the Avengers. And due to both of their success on various other movies and other projects and having worked with Marvel, they both agreed upon one thing while writing the script. The focus would be to try to avoid pure scenes of exposition. And during this process, Marvel was going through a legal battle with some of the comic creators and their contributions, so the decision was made to take War Machine out and replace him with the Iron Patriot, which of course in the comics was not James Rhodes, it was in fact Norman Osborn. Due to subsequent rewrites, it was made intentional that they were going to take elements of the story of Extremis, which was the 2005 run of Iron Man, which many people who were just now discovering Iron Man after the first and second movie would inevitably end up picking up. And they decided that the first two acts of the movie would be very character-centric and to drive the plot forward. But since this was a sequel, there was of course the tendency that everything had to be more hectic, more frantic, larger scale, and everything pretty much had to be bigger than the previous movie. So the decision was made that the first two acts of the movie would still be like classic Iron Man, but that the third act would be all-out insanity, seeing a ton of battling. Now at this stage, the initial drafts actually included Maya Hansen to actually be the villain of the piece. Now unfortunately, due to the interference of Marvel Entertainment, which of course runs the TV division, they didn't see the value of having her as a villain because she could not move action figures, and they put a mandate that they changed this up. And during the subsequent rewrites trying to get her out of the movie, it was decided that the Mandarin would finally show his face along with Killian. And it was during the rewrites of these drafts that Pence actually suggested that the Mandarin would be a fake, and Shane Black agreed upon this, and they decided he would be an overacting British stage performer. And they insisted with going with the idea of the fool that would be kind of sitting there declaring that he's a terrorist all around the world. and that if you were smart, you would be able to figure out that obviously this dude was a puppet to somebody pulling the strings. Now, when it came to writing the beginning of the movie, this was a major problem, and it was reworked constantly throughout every iteration of the script up until finally editing the movie. Many versions of the script saw it actually starting out with Tony Stark as a child. Others started with him crashing and then telling his story while he's laying there in the cold snow, and various other slight alterations to both of these. And finally, after the script was written, the pre-production of the movie began in September of 2011. At that moment, Marvel Studios reached an agreement to shoot the film primarily out of the Screen Gem Studios in Wilmington, North Carolina. Michigan was also considered, but unfortunately they didn't go here as North Carolina had better tax incentives. And in April of 2012, Ben Kingsley would officially enter negotiations for the role of the villainous Mandarin, who has been teased since the first Iron Man movie. A few weeks would go by and it would officially be announced by the producer Kevin Feige that Iron Man 3 would begin shooting in North Carolina in just a couple of weeks, and that the film was going to be way more like the first act of Iron Man 1, aka Tony-centric. And this was an important idea since we already saw that Tony could just call the Avengers if they needed him. So the idea was to make him go back to basics, strip him on everything, and make him rebuild the character. And just a few days after that, the Walt Disney Company China and Marvel Studios and DMG Entertainment announced an agreement that Iron Man 3 would be co-produced in China, with the involvement of Marvel in the co-production matters, which also would see DMG distributing the film in China with Disney. And this would also lead to a special Asian version of the movie being released overseas, which to this day still has not seen a release over in the United States, which features additional scenes that are set in Asia. Following that announcement, a few weeks would go by and it was revealed that Guy Pearce entered negotiations to play the character of Aldrich Killian. The character would loosely be based on the character of Aldrich who appeared in the Extremis comic book storyline. And at the same time, Chinese star Andy Lau also became involved in negotiations to join the film, who would be portrayed as an old friend of Stark's that comes to his aid. Andy would ultimately end up turning down the role, which would end up going Wang Huick. A few days would go by and we heard rumors and then a confirmation that Jessica Chastain was in discussion with Marvel Studios for an unspecified role, and she would have taken it had it not been due to scheduling conflicts. Instead, the role would go to Rebecca Hall, who was cast in her place. She was described as a scientist who played a pivotal role in the nanotechnology known as Extremis. At this time, had it not been for the Marvel Entertainment side of Marvel Studios, this character would have been the actual main villain of the film. Unfortunately, due to Ike Perlmutter's interference and him not believing that a woman could be a villain as he didn't see their toys as selling viably, he decided that this needed to be changed. And of course, it was announced that Jon Favreau would be returning to the Iron Man universe, but he would only be serving as Happy Hogan. And to round off the casting, William Sadler was cast as the President of the United States, who would go on to make a few more appearances in the MCU, including some in the Marvel television series Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. With the entire cast rounded out, shooting began on May 23rd of 2012. As of course every film tends to have a working title, the film was titled Caged Heat. Over the next couple months, various locations around the United States were used to create some of the iconic scenes in the movie. From the SAS Institute with a large Christmas tree set up front to of course Double Down for the theater, to various international airports and the port of Wellington, which was used for the end climactic battle of the film. And from July 19th to August 1st of 2012, filming took place on Oak Island, North Carolina, and this was mainly to shoot a bunch of aerial drops above the Atlantic Ocean. This was of course all done for the aerial scenes including Air Force One, where a bunch of people were dropping from the plane and they had to be rescued by Iron Man, which would also be the major highlight of the Super Bowl spot that they would be having. Now, originally this sequence was actually supposed to be done with a green screen, but things lined up in a very good positive way when the unit director Brian Smots decided to do it practically since he knew the Red Bull skydiving team. And what is really interesting is the fact that they actually used matte paintings of Florida for the coastline, something not many films use these days considering it is an antiquated technique. Majority of the actual people falling out of the plane were just CGI enhanced actual skydivers, and the main skydiver would actually be the one enhanced with CGI armor to actually look like Iron Man. After this was done, the filming would transfer over to North Carolina to Rose Hill in August of 2012, and the actual town name was incorporated into the movie's plot. And this is the town that Tony visits that is set in Tennessee. And it was then announced on August 14th that actress Dale Dickey has officially been cast in the movie to play an important role. And the next day, on August 15th, everything would come to a giant screeching halt, as Robert Downey Jr. suffered a massive ankle injury, which would set them about 2 weeks back, and during this time, Shane Black and Pierce actually went back and rewrote some of the elements of the script, and shooting resumed right at the end of August. The next set of shooting would happen in Florida on October 1st of the very same year, in Daniel Beach around South Florida. This also saw the return of Robert Downey Jr. from his ankle injury. The shooting here would be centered around a replica of a Malibu restaurant named Neptune's Net, and more shooting was done on Miami Beach and the Miami Beach Resort on October 10th and 11th, with production returning back to Wilmington in mid-October for additional filming. And filming would officially wrap in the United States in early November. Just a few weeks later, it was announced that filming would begin in Beijing, China on December 10th, and filming was supposed to wrap about a week later. The interesting fact during this filming is that they did not include any of the main cast or crew going over there. And after that was a wrap, Shane Black would go on to start location scouting in January of 2013 to various locations around India. After everything was done, reshoots were scheduled, and they mainly centered around the character of the Mandarin, as everybody felt that the initial versions of the character just didn't feel right. So after all the shooting was said and done, it was time to go into post-production. Over 2,000 visual effects shots were created by various studios across the world, from Scanline FX to Digital Domain to the of course world famous Weta Digital. And at this time it was also reported that, like a typical blockbuster movie, they more or less worked around the clock. Between January of 2013 and April, the collective crew had only 1 day of downtime, and every single day was an average of 16 hours of work. And since the company did employ various studios to do different visual effects, this was the reason that they actually decided to use suits in partial on set. So the Mark 42 was handled by up to 5 different studios for different scenes that would all have to mash up together, so there was a consistency between everything going on. And it is also notable that Robert Downey Jr. is rather short, so he had to wear some corrective high heels, which would make him about 6'5", so they would know how the suit would balance between each visual shot so they could have a consistent height to the character. Now, of course, I already talked about how Robert Downey Jr. had an ankle injury. This would force the visual effects artist to take it to a whole new step. So there is a fair amount of shots in which Robert Downey Jr. is not even there. It was actually a body double with a CG face made by Weta Digital put over the double's face. The unedited cut of the movie with everything complete totaled about 3 hours and 15 minutes long. In the subsequent edits, it would be reduced down to 119 minutes with the credits not included, and 130 with the credits included. And of course, as was popular at the time, there was a post-production conversion to 3D, to IMAX, and of course a bunch of other things like Dolby Atmos being enhanced for immersive sound experience. Now, when it came to the soundtrack of the movie certainly opened up different than most Marvel films, as it opened up with the Blue Man Group's I'm Blue. I distinctly remember everybody in my theater just kind of looking around, acting confused as if they started the wrong film reel. The actual score for the movie was composed by Brian Taylor, who was signed on in October of 2012. The initial idea was to produce something memorable yet very cinematic sounding that could be in line with the rest of the the Iron Man films, but also have its own feeling. Kevin Feige wanted something that is deeply thematic with components of a strong melody. And Tyler himself would go to mention that he found a lot of inspiration in John Williams' work on Raiders of the Lost Ark. And of course, the music was going to be conducted by an orchestra, and they decided to go with the London Philharmonic Orchestra. Now, when it finally came down to editing the movie and releasing it worldwide, we would see that Disney would of course do the worldwide distribution, where of course it was distributed by a different company, DMG Entertainment, in China. The Chinese cut specifically featured an additional 4 minutes of the movie that are not featured anywhere else. Majority of these scenes include the character of Dr. Wu, who at one point does actually go in to interact with Iron Man and actually has an operation on Stark. And to offset some of the costs for the movie, there was various product placements in the Asian territories for the film. The film's initial premiere would be at the Le Grand Rex in Paris on April 14th of 2013, with Robert Downey Jr. and Gwyneth Paltrow being in attendance. And the premiere in the United States would happen on April 24th, but at that point it was kind of pointless considering the movie already opened in 46 other countries on April 22nd. And it would finally see its United States release a week later, opening on 4,253 screens. And this is where controversy would start to set in. Theater chains such as Regal Cinemas, AMC, and a few others decided to put ticket sales on hold due to the fact that Iron Man was in such a high demand and that Disney saw their movies as higher quality. They wanted the ticket prices to remain the same but to get a bigger share of the cut. Dispute after dispute, they quickly reached an agreement, and on April 25th of 2013, everybody agreed to start selling the pre-sale tickets again, with the IMAX screenings being first on April 25th of 2013 internationally and on May 3rd in the United States. And the film also makes a noticeable use of the 4DX experience in format and seating, which of course features all the bells and whistles you can find in the craziest, most over-the-top theaters, such as odor effects, fog, wind, and various other things like tilting seats and strobing lights to make you really immersed in the movie. For the marketing of the film, we knew that this was going to be big, we just didn't know how big it would be, until San Diego Comic-Con in July of 2012, where the Mark 43 was revealed for the first time on the convention floor with various other armors that would be featured in the film. But perhaps the biggest marketing came during the Super Bowl of the year of its release in 2013, where they had a 30-second spot with a full trailer releasing right after. The quick spot would go on to break records and be one of the most watched things that they've put out for any movie up until that point. Various other marketing things were used, such as Audi being used for product placement with cars, much like they were used in the first two Iron Man films. Of course, Oracle, which was seen in Avengers and Iron Man 2, was once again very prominent. And various other products based on the movie would see their way out there, such as Lego sets, the action figures by Hasbro, and of course a mobile game made by Gameloft. The video game is very loosely based on the movie, and by very loosely I mean it features Iron Man and the suits, and that is pretty much about it. The best way to describe it would be that it is one of those endless runner games where the players are more or less just attempting to dodge objects while scoring points for completing the weapons at a certain speed with certain accuracy. And of course, since this was a mobile game available for phones, everything was more or less handled with the touchscreen or the gyroscope. And majority of the missions consisted of kill X number of enemies or make it to the X location in the allocated amount of time. In total, the game initially offered 18 variations of the Iron Man armor for you to customize and be able to, of course, buy various pieces with real money. And the game was a sort of sequel to Iron Man 3 dealing with AIM and MODOK. One of the most notable things, though, which would indicate a hint towards a possible partnership in the future, was the inclusion of Oscorp from the Spider-Man film franchise, but we'll talk about Spider-Man at another time. The game currently sits at a 48 out of 100, so it's definitely the best of the Iron Mans, I would say, but that's not saying much. Now the marketing didn't stop there, as there was a huge push in Disneyland to make everything more or less Iron Man and try to make sure that everybody was aware of the movie coming out, and this definitely paid off. Iron Man 3 would go on to become the highest grossing film of all time and the second highest grossing film of 2013. Just on its opening day alone, the film managed to make $68.9 million, and by the end of its first weekend, it managed to make $174.1 million in the United States alone. That is more than future films such as Batman v Superman and Captain America Civil War would ultimately make. In total, the film would go on to make $409 million in the United States and $805 million worldwide in the international box office, for a total of $1.2 billion, which means that they were $400 million over what most people were expecting the movie to make and sit comfortably at $800 million. When factoring in the marketing and everything else for the movie, the total actual profit that the movie made was $391 million, which is a huge success. The film released to generally positive reviews overall and sits at a very comfortable 79% on Rotten Tomatoes, with the average rating being a 7 out of 10 based on 286 reviews. The film would go on to be nominated for various awards, winning quite a few of them. And the home media release actually featured an additional one-shot, All Hail the King, which would focus on Ben Kingsley's The Mandarin being locked up at Seagate Prison. Now, of course, this is very noticeable as it was a major hint towards a future character who would get his own Netflix series, Luke Cage. But not only that, this also featured a cameo from the Iron Man 2 villain, Justin Hammer. And ever since the release of the home media, there's been various discussions and rumors about a possible Iron Man 4. But Robert Downey Jr. would ultimately go on to reprise his role in future Avengers sequels, and of course Captain America Civil War. But before we get to those, we have to take a look at the next film that would release that very same year. In an unexpected move, Disney decided to release Thor: The Dark World in November of 2013. The development of Thor: The Dark World began very early, as soon as the release of Thor in 2011, where the president of Marvel Studios was hyping up the Avengers, and he said after that movie, Thor would go on into new adventures, which more or less confirmed the sequel. And at this time, when being interviewed, Kenneth Branagh, the director of Thor, responded saying, "It's kind of news to me," as he was unsure if he was going to be brought back for the sequel. He also went on to add that he would love to do a Thor 2, but he's not willing to commit to anything until everybody sits down and talks, and he specifically said it'll be a great thing if he does make it, but if not, he gives them their blessing. The announcement of the sequel was then later on halted by Kevin Feige, who said that they would wait to see how the first Thor did in box office before initially announcing the sequel officially at something like a comic convention. And he stated that Don Payne is working on story ideas for the sequel if it was to happen. He also said that they had various options with Kenneth Branagh possibly discussing a comeback, but right now the focus would be on the first movie. And then after that and the result of the Avengers, they would figure out where their character would go next in a natural storyline progression. Only 2 months after the release of Thor, officially in June 2011, Walt Disney Studios set a July 26, 2013 release date for the Thor sequel, officially announcing that Chris Hemsworth would be reprising his role as the title hero. And just a week later, it was also reported that Kenneth Branagh would not be back in the director's chair, but instead would likely be involved in some sort of productive capacity. Just a few weeks later, it was confirmed that Kenneth Branagh would not in fact be directing the movie, and this was due to the necessary commitment for the longer shoot schedule than they had for the first movie, as the second film was going to be heavier on the special effects and require more time to shoot. He did not see himself as a fit person to be able to tackle it for this extended period of time. And Branagh had this to say: "It was a long time making the first film, and they were way too quick for me to get straight back into another, but it was a pleasant experience and a film I am very proud of." And the next day, it was officially announced that Don Payne, the writer of the first Thor film, would be brought on board to write the script for the second one. Wanting to get a quick start on the film and enter production in the sequel rather quickly, in August, Brian Kirk officially entered early negotiations to be able to take on the Thor sequel. This would have been his first big-time directorial debut on a feature film, as he's mostly been known for Showtime, BBC, and the likes of Game of Thrones. And just a month later, in September of 2011, Tom Hiddleston officially confirmed he would be returning in the sequel. And he was speculating, saying that the end result of what happened the last two times we saw the character would kind of be tackled in this, and they would tackle the responsibility of what Loki has done. And right after that, it was officially announced that Kirk has officially walked away and passed up directing the movie, and negotiations starting with Patty Jenkins, who at this point was known for directing the critically acclaimed Monsters and the pilot episode of AMC's The Killing. And just a few days after that, Kevin Feige would give an official statement on the sequel, saying it would literally take Thor to other worlds and would be a journey film about him and the characters he is with, such as Jane Foster, and the new dynamic he is going to have with his father. And during this, he would also go on to say that the broader stakes of the 9 worlds would also be in effect, thus giving us our first look into the scope of the second movie, which of course the 9 worlds would reference the 9 realms. And in October of 2011, Marvel officially confirmed that Patty Jenkins would be directing the sequel and that Natalie Portman would officially be returning. And along with that, it was also announced that the film would be getting a delay into November 15th of 2013 to give the movie some space and breathing room from the rush of the summer blockbusters. And just 2 months after the confirmation of Patty Jenkins joining, in December of 2011, she officially exited the project, citing creative differences. But she did have this to say: "I have had a great time working with Marvel. We parted on very good terms, and I look forward to working with them again." After this, she would go on to pitch a movie to Warner Brothers, which would inevitably end up being her directorial debut with a superhero with Wonder Woman. And just days after she had walked away, The Hollywood Reporter came out with a report stating that Marvel was looking at Alan Taylor for his work from Game of Thrones. But along with this, it was also reported that the script was getting a complete rewrite and that they were looking at a possible 3 or 4 different writers to be able to quickly do this, to throw the movie together and put it back on schedule. And just a few weeks after these rumors, it was officially confirmed that yes, Alan Taylor would be directing Thor: The Dark World, which at that time was still called Thor 2, and he was cited for his work with Game of Thrones, Mad Men, Boardwalk Empire, and a few other things. And Kevin Feige had this to say: "With Alan directing, we got a few more layers of patina, of texture, of reality into our golden realm." And just a few days after that official hiring, in January of the same year, Marvel officially hired screenwriter Robert Rodat to rewrite the script, with Tom Hiddleston saying that the shooting was expected to begin in London in summer of 2012. And it was later confirmed by Chris Hemsworth himself that the actual filming of the movie would begin in August of 2012, with Hemsworth revealing that the film would have a little bit more of a Viking feel and a Viking influence look, which is why they had Alan Taylor from his experience with Game of Thrones. And over the next couple of months, we would get details here and there on exactly what was happening. Kevin Feige said that this is definitely going to pick up with the relationship between Loki and Thor and the events that transpired in the last movie, but more importantly in the events of the Avengers. And a lot of this would be progressing in terms of where everything left off with the character of Jane. And while Feige was playing very coy on who exactly would be the villain, he did say that Loki would be a part of the movie, but he said there will be a different villain, another big villain along with Loki. In May of 2012, it was officially revealed that Mads Mikkelsen had began talking and was offered the role to play the villain of the film. And along with this, it was officially confirmed that Anthony Hopkins would be returning as Odin. And by the end of that week, the official release date would get moved up 1 week to November 8th of 2013. And by June of 2012, majority of the cast has officially been announced. Idris Elba was back once again, Jamie Alexander, Ray Stevenson, and a few other notable people. The one omission would be Josh Dallas, who announced he would not be reprising his role as Fendrel. And this was mainly due to conflict of interest and scheduling problems because of what was happening, due to him already working for Disney on their highly critically acclaimed and successful Once Upon a Time. But it was quickly announced that Zach Levi of Chuck fame would be taking over, so this was clearly something that they knew was going to be happening as they announced it right away. And in July of 2012, Mads Mikkelsen officially stated he would not be appearing in the movie after trying to make it to actually be a villain in a Marvel movie for the past couple of years. And this was in majority in his commitment to the Hannibal TV series. And at the 2012 San Diego Comic-Con International, aka SDCC, it was officially announced that the title of the movie would be Thor: The Dark World. And production was set to begin right at the end of July, early August. And in early August, it was officially announced that Christopher Eccleston had entered final negotiations to be playing Malekith the Accursed. The film was also going to be traveling to a familiar location for Alan Taylor in Iceland, where he shot parts of Game of Thrones. And on August 22nd, it was officially announced that Kat Dennings was hired to reprise her role as Darcy Lewis, with Adewale Acuña-Agbaje cast as Algrim. And principal photography for the film officially started on September 10th of 2012. With the first leg of shooting starting in Burnwood, Surrey, England, under the working title of Thursday Morning. And much like Iron Man 3, around the same time, Jamie Alexander suffered a slight injury after she slipped while it was raining. And on October 12th in 2012, production officially moved to Iceland, and it is cited as being as one of the most expensive productions and shoots to ever be shot on this island. And at the same time, Disney officially came out and released a statement saying that the film would be released in 3D. And just a few weeks later, it was officially announced that the shooting has been changed over to Greenwich, London, in the Old Royal Naval College. And shooting was to take place in and around London till December of 2012. And Jamie Alexander officially tweeted that they finished principal photography in December 14th of 2012, Disney having spent $237.6 million on Thor: The Dark World, but $37 million of that was offset by payment from the UK tax authorities, so thus the movie cost around $200 million. But then some more factors have to be taken in there for what the actual budget for the entire movie was, which would place the movie at a very comfortable $170 million budget. Another person who worked very closely with Alan Taylor on Game of Thrones would be Kramer Morthenu, who was the director of photography on Thor: The Dark World, and he said for the sequel they wanted a more grittier, boots-on-the-ground feeling inspired by Game of Thrones. Now when it came time to choosing some familiar locations, they actually decided to shoot some stuff at Stonehenge. The next time we would hear anything would be in July of 2013, where it was reported that the film was going to be going into reshoots. And in August of that year, it was also reported by Alan Taylor himself that the film's reshoots were actually going to be to add more Hiddleston as Loki, as they thought that he was going to be a huge fan favorite. Unfortunately, shooting these scenes is what ultimately led to the villain of Malekith being thrown under the bus and getting far less scenery. And after the reshoots were complete, it was confirmed that the film would of course be seeing a Marvel IMAX release, including IMAX and IMAX 3D. Now during some of the actual shooting of the movie, where they were having problems with the script up until last minute, Marvel's The Avengers director Joss Whedon was brought in a few times onto the set of the movie to rewrite scenes to be able to fit it into how they needed them to. And in October of 2013, Tony Curran tweeted out that he would be portraying Odin's father, Bor, in flashbacks. This was later confirmed by Kevin Feige. And right after that, Kevin Feige would also say that they see this as the Loki trilogy, saying that he is as important to the Thor movies as Thor himself. And right before the release of the film, it was actually confirmed by James Gunn himself that the movie would have a post-credit scene involving a tie-in directly to the Guardians of the Galaxy. Now, of course, course, in post-production there was varying CG effects that had to be done on the movie. The most prominent one and the most noticeable one, which was the most advertised, was of course the one designed by Blur Studios, who did the entire prologue sequence, which takes place about 4,000 years before the film starts. This is of course the fight between Bor, Odin's father, and the elves. In post-production, it was also decided by Alan Taylor himself that he wanted actual Asgard to look more livable and not so fantasy-like like we saw in the first movie. So they went to great lengths to be able to place these characters on the ground level so you see everyday life happening behind them. Now, along with the movie, they needed another score, and of course Patrick Doyle was brought on in August of 2012 when he started discussing returning for the movie after he did the work on the first one. Unfortunately, due to some conflicts and various other reasons that aren't exactly known, he actually ended up leaving the project, and in June of 2013, Marvel hired Brian Taylor, the same man who scored Iron Man 3, to be the replacement for the previous candidates. Unfortunately to me, this is one of the most forgettable scores in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. I found nothing special about it and is definitely not one I ever go back and listen to. The composer did say that they were trying to meld things like Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings, but for me personally, I don't hear it. The soundtrack was released digitally on October 28th, 2013. And next up was the worldwide premiere of Thor, which came out on October 22nd, 2013, and premiered in London. The film would then get a UK release date 8 days later on October 30th, and the United States release coming in at November 7th of 2013. The actual box office was pretty huge for Thor: The Dark World considering all things, and that the fact it followed up on a movie which large amounts of people just kind of found mediocre. The film would go on to make $644.6 million in its entire theatrical run, and in just 20 days it was able to pass what the original Thor movie did. The full net profit for the film was $139.5 million. And in the long run, despite making less money than Man of Steel or the likes of Batman v Superman releasing much later, the movie was more profitable than both of those combined. When it comes to the actual review scores, the movie currently sits on Rotten Tomatoes at a 66 approval rating and an average rating of 6.2 out of 10 based on 247 critic reviews. And by many, it is considered the worst movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I am not going to argue that with anybody. After everything is said and done, this might be the most forgettable movie of the entire MCU. But of course, there is a shining beacon at the end of this road, as Thor Ragnarok is going to be releasing in November of 2017. But we will talk about that in due time. So join me for part 6 of this retrospective, where we are going to look at arguably one of the greatest comic book movies of all time with a Captain America sequel, and of course the groundbreaking movie that would change Hollywood and perception of Z-list characters with Guardians of the Galaxy. Hey guys, Armin here, just reminding you that this video was made possible thanks to patrons. If you guys are interested in supporting us and making sure we keep the lights on, check out our Patreon where you can join other fans in supporting the CBC, delivering content you guys have come to love and expect. And if you can't do that, give us a like and a subscribe, that goes a long way too.